Welcome back. A recent report by the European Investment Bank, International Solar Alliance, and the African Union shows that Africa has the potential to produce 1 trillion euros worth of green hydrogen by 2035. And that's 1 trillion, the 1 trillion green hydrogen investment can deliver the equivalent of more than one-third of Africa's current energy consumption. It can also boost GDP, improve clean water supply, and empower communities, as well as reduce emissions by 40%. Now, according to the study, Africa can secure access to clean and sustainable energy on the continent and become a global energy player through green hydrogen exports. Now, Chinan Dikwal, hydrogen expert and vice chair of the African Energy Council, AEC, joins us to give us more insights and the possibilities of this in Africa. Good to have you on the program, Chinan.
I will. Great pleasure to be here. Yes, great talking to your listeners.
Now, Chinan, this is the first detailed research of the feasible development of green hydrogen across Africa. Now, what are the requirements to enable the 50 million tons of green hydrogen by 2035?
Thanks, Will. I think that's a great question. So a couple of things before I answer that question. I was going to say exactly that. This is the first sort of continent-wide study that looks to pull together all the strands of work that are happening independently across various parts of the continent. That's the first thing to say. You're 100% right. It's commissioned by the African Union, so at the center of it, the coordinating body, but also, the International Solar Alliance and the European Investment Bank. So just to put that in context, it's a whole consortium of financiers, an organization of African bodies, but also, sort of developers, solid developers coming together. It will require quite a lot of investment, but also infrastructure to make this happen across Africa. So if you think about where we are today, there are pockets of activity happening sort of in the northwest part of Africa, around Mauritania and Morocco. Very much so. There are other things happening in the south of Africa as well, and some happening in the east around Egypt. Each of those projects, producing green hydrogen, so renewable energy, solar combined with water to produce green hydrogen. Each of those requires a huge amount of investment that runs into billions and billions of dollars, and ultimately becomes an infrastructure question. Do we have the necessary infrastructure to make that happen and produce that hydrogen at the beach in Africa and then consume it in Africa, but also ship it internationally so we can get paid for that export? Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, but this study, when we look at it, it's got a lot of support from African governments. But I'm wondering, why green hydrogen for exports? You just mentioned it, and not Africa's industrialization. Why is it not focused on that?
A great question. So it's both, actually, Will. It's both. First thing is to produce it and consume it here in Africa, generate energy here in Africa and consume it here. And then the second component is then for us to export it out into key demand centers around the world. And there are several around us in Africa. But if I just make this point, for Africa to industrialize, we would have to very rapidly have the energy required to run our industries and everything. Now, that requirement stays even if the energy is crude oil or gas or whatever it is, or hydrogen. That requirement stays. So the first precursor in this study says that once the hydrogen is produced, we'd like to consume it in here. Again, it goes back to that question of the infrastructure required for us to consume that hydrogen. Do we have the necessary pipelines? For hydrogen pipelines, extremely specialty type pipelines. They're not like natural gas pipelines that you just produce with carbon steel. These are extremely specialist type pipelines that are required. Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the compressors at hand? I suppose the key thing for Africa is for that to happen, you would need a huge amount of investment. Now, going to the export side, that's perhaps a lot clearer. It's much, much clearer, because when you produce hydrogen on the beach and then you turn that hydrogen into a carrier for you to take to Europe, that's I think it's a lot more advanced, if you ask me. It's a lot more advanced putting hydrogen on a ship and sending away, into Europe markets, because those markets already have some infrastructure that can receive that hydrogen. What Africa needs to think about today domestically is the question of, once we produce it, do we have the pipelines to send it, let's say to Abuja or to Lagos? And even when it gets to Lagos, do we have infrastructure there for us to be able to combust that hydrogen or use it in fuel cells? Do we have those at hand to utilize that energy?
Mm. Now, you mentioned some countries, and the study also shows that about 4 spots, African hubs, were selected for this. We have Mauritania, Morocco, Southern Africa, and Egypt, as you mentioned earlier. Why is Nigeria missing in the mix here?
It's a great question, actually. I've asked that question myself, but I think it's slightly clear. So what the study does is it looks at 3 key hubs of development. The first hub, like I was saying, there is the northwest. So the first hub is northwestern. So it has Mauritania and Morocco in there producing. I think it's something like 300. Well, actually, I think 350 gigawatt capacity of installed solar. Then you have the eastern hub there. That's mainly Egypt. So Egypt producing green hydrogen there with a pipeline. I think about 1,900 going into Greece. If I go back to the one on the northwest, that pipeline I think goes into Spain. Actually, they're looking at pipeline to Spain, and then on the southern part of Africa, you have South Africa and Namibia using hydrogen for exporting Japan and other countries. Nigeria is a bit missing from there, and I think it's 2 reasons. One, Nigeria is very gas rich. Okay, so we haven't quite, I think, in the last couple of years, given a lot of attention to green hydrogen. There have been quite a few discussions around blue hydrogen. Okay, so let me just describe that. Green hydrogen is produced from solar energy or wind, renewable sources. Blue hydrogen is produced from natural gas, which Nigeria has an abundance of. So in Nigeria, we have an abundance of natural gas. So there have been discussions of blue hydrogen in Nigeria as opposed to green, which is why you might see that, on this particular study, Nigeria is a bit missing. The other thing, of course, again, is for you to produce green hydrogen, which is what this study is, you need a massive amount of land, a massive amount of land. So if you take the case of Mauritania, about 5% of the total land in Mauritania is going to be used for hydrogen production.
Okay, Chinan.
Nigeria is quite dense in population.
Okay.
So there's also the constraint of land in that regard. So there are several things that meant that Nigeria is missing from there, but we do have the advantage without a doubt when it comes to blue hydrogen. Nigeria can produce blue hydrogen much cheaper, perhaps even than green hydrogen.
Oh, thank you so much, Chinan Dickwell, Vice Chair, African Energy Council, AEC, for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. And probably we'll have more conversation on this some other time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Bob.